Childhood is supposed to be filled with laughter, toys, and sweet memories. But what if those memories hide something darker? Something you can't explain, yet you still feel it crawling under your skin years later. Tonight, we'll dive into 3 disturbing childhood memories. Moments that seemed innocent at first, but turned into terrifying experiences that left scars long after the night ended. These aren't just stories, they're echoes of fear that never fade. Childhood has always been seen as the time of innocence, a phase where the world is colored by wonder and imagination, yet sometimes the innocence of those years carries shadows that are hard to forget. The first chapter begins by diving into the unsettling undertone of what it means to remember fragments of a past that refuses to remain buried. It is not about the bright memories of birthdays, playground laughter, or bedtime stories, but about the quiet hours when the house grew still and the world outside the window seemed far away. In those hours, a child begins to notice things adults often dismiss, things that crawl at the edges of memory and refuse to let go. The narrator introduces the idea that children often see what others cannot, their minds unclouded by logic yet sharpened by an instinct to sense when something is wrong. These small instincts become the seeds of memories that carry dread even into adulthood. The setting is a modest childhood home, the kind of place where safety is supposed to be absolute, where every corner should offer comfort, but the walls seem to hold secrets of their own. The air at night has a strange thickness, as though silence itself is alive and waiting. The narrator recalls lying awake in bed, staring at the ceiling while the hum of the refrigerator echoed faintly from the kitchen, and the ticking of the clock in the hallway marked the slow crawl of time. It was in moments like these when unease crept in, not with sudden shocks or loud noises, but with the subtle sensation that one was not truly alone. The mind of a child, so receptive to whispers and unseen movements, begins to weave a reality that is not entirely imagined. The chapter explores how memories can be fragmented, like torn photographs, showing only glimpses of what happened, yet still managing to carry the full weight of terror. Sometimes it was a flicker of movement caught in the corner of the eye, other times a shadow that did not belong to any lamp or tree outside the window. These fleeting details never form a complete picture, and perhaps that is what makes them more terrifying, because the gaps are filled by the mind's darkest possibilities. The narrator reflects on how even as adults, people return to these moments and wonder if it was just the tricks of a child's mind, or if something truly lingered in the house after nightfall. The story describes the tension between the innocence of childhood and the creeping intrusion of fear. During the day, everything seemed ordinary, filled with sunlight and familiar routines. Toys scattered across the floor, cartoons playing on the television, and the smell of food drifting from the kitchen gave a sense of warmth. But at night, the same toys seemed to stare with unblinking eyes. The corners of the room stretched into deep pools of darkness, and the warmth of the day dissolved into a chilling quiet. It is in this duality that childhood becomes both a sanctuary and a prison, a place where the most haunting experiences often begin quietly, tucked inside memories that only reveal their horror when recalled years later. Childhood is often painted as a time of purity, joy, and comfort, but buried beneath those bright recollections are fragments of fear that cling stubbornly to memory. The first chapter opens with the haunting truth that children are far more sensitive than they are given credit for, able to notice what adults brush aside or rationalize away. The smallest flicker of movement in a darkened corner, the creak of a floorboard when no one is walking, the subtle shift in air that makes a room suddenly colder, all register deeply within a child's mind. These moments are not always forgotten with age. Instead, they hide in the folds of memory and emerge years later with greater clarity and unease. The narrator recalls a home that should have been a safe place, filled with familiar sounds and the warmth of family. During the day it looked ordinary, even comforting, yet at night it seemed to transform into something different altogether. The ceiling loomed higher, the shadows deepened, and silence seemed to crawl across the walls like a living thing. The distant hum of appliances and the steady ticking of a hallway clock were the only sounds that broke the stillness, but rather than soothing, they amplified the feeling that the house was not entirely empty. As a child, lying in bed beneath the covers, there was an unshakable sense of being watched, though there was no one there. It was not the kind of fear born from nightmares, but from the undeniable instinct that something was present. The memories come in fragments, sharp flashes of detail that never fully piece together, but still manage to carry the weight of dread. There was the sense of movement in the corner of the eye, as if a figure had just slipped out of sight. There was the peculiar moment when shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long, reaching into places the light should have touched. Sometimes it was nothing more than the feeling of breath that was not one's own lingering too close in the dark. These moments were brushed away during the day, but at night they returned stronger, persistent, and suffocating. Even as an adult looking back, the narrator cannot decide if these were the wild creations of a young mind, or if something truly lingered unseen within those walls. The chapter builds on the dual nature of childhood, where daytime is filled with comfort and laughter, but night transforms everything familiar into a stage for fear. The same toys that brought happiness now seem to glare with unblinking eyes in the dim light. The closet door that held clothes and shoes by day became a gateway to something unknown by night. Even the silence that seemed so peaceful under the sun turned into a suffocating weight when the moon rose. These contrasts created the foundation for memories that never fully faded. Childhood, rather than being only a place of innocence, became a time when the most disturbing experiences etched themselves deeply into the mind, waiting to resurface long after those nights had passed. The first memory that stands out is tied to the whispers in the closet, a place that should have been harmless, but instead became the source of restless nights and trembling fear. The closet was an ordinary wooden structure, painted white with simple handles, nothing unusual about it during the day. It was where clothes hung neatly, where shoes were tucked at the bottom, and where forgotten toys sometimes ended up. Yet when darkness filled the room, the closet took on a presence that seemed larger than the space it occupied. The narrator remembers lying in bed, staring at it, feeling a weight in the air that grew heavier with each passing night. It wasn't the kind of fear sparked by a wild imagination, but something that seemed to radiate from within, a pull that demanded attention, even when the eyes wanted to look away. The first time the whispers came, they were so faint that it was hard to tell if they were real. A child's mind is used to picking up sounds that adults dismiss, but this was not the house creaking or the wind brushing against the windows. This was something deliberate, soft voices that seemed to drift out from the cracks of the closet door. They were not clear enough to form words, but they carried a tone, a cadence that resembled speech. At first, the child pulled the blanket over their head, hoping the sound would stop, but the muffled murmur continued as if aware of the fear it caused. Each night the whispers returned, always low, always just out of reach, as though the figures behind the door were conversing with one another, but careful never to be understood. The memory unfolds with an image of nights spent staring at the closet, body frozen in place, afraid to move, afraid to breathe too loudly. Some nights the whispers were accompanied by the sound of something shifting inside, a faint scrape, the suggestion of weight pressing against the wooden panels. The closet never opened on its own, but the sense that something was waiting behind it became impossible to dismiss. The child once dared to tell their parents about the voices, only to be met with a reassuring smile and the explanation that it was probably just a dream or the house settling. Yet the nights continued, and so did the voices. The disbelief of adults only deepened the sense of isolation, forcing the child to confront the terror alone. As the memory sharpens, there are fragments that refuse to fade. The air in the room always grew colder when the whispers began, the kind of chill that seeped into the skin even under heavy blankets. Sometimes, in the faint moonlight slipping through the window, shadows seemed to shift against the door, as if something inside was pressing closer to the surface. The child never found the courage to open it at night, but in the mornings, they would rush to pull the doors wide and find nothing more than neatly hung clothes and scattered toys. The emptiness was almost worse than discovering something, because it meant the voices left no proof. What remained was the gnawing memory of nights filled with whispers that no one else heard. Whispers that seemed to know the fear of the child who lay frozen in bed, listening. Night after night, night terrors are often dismissed as the overactive imagination of a child, fleeting dreams that vanish by sunrise. But some experiences etch themselves so deeply into memory that they blur the line between sleep and reality. The nights described in this memory began with a sudden awakening, heart pounding as though it had been running a race, the body drenched in cold sweat. The room looked familiar, the same bed, the same walls, the same faint glow of the streetlight slipping through the curtains. Yet nothing felt safe. It was as if the air itself was alive, pressing down with a weight that made every breath difficult. The child would lie there, wide awake, convinced that something unseen lingered at the edge of the bed. The images that came with these terrors were not the strange, fleeting shapes of ordinary dreams, but vivid, lingering visions. A tall figure seemed to stand in the corner of the room, unmoving but present, its outline never fully visible yet impossible to ignore. The child's eyes would dart toward it again and again, hoping it would dissolve back into shadow, but instead it seemed to grow clearer the longer it was watched. Sometimes, in the grip of these episodes, the figure would begin to move slowly, as though gliding closer, and the sensation of paralysis would hold the body in place. The child could not scream, could not cry out, could only feel the weight of fear pressing tighter and tighter against the chest. What made these nights worse was the repetition, the certainty that it would happen again. After the first few experiences, sleep itself became something to dread. The child would delay closing their eyes, clutching the blanket tightly, yet exhaustion always won. When the eyes shut, there was no guarantee of rest, only the possibility of waking to find that same figure waiting. Sometimes the terror came not as a vision but as a sound, a deep vibration in the air that felt more like a growl than a noise. Other times it was a sensation, the distinct impression of someone sitting on the edge of the bed, the mattress dipping under invisible weight. Every detail felt too sharp to be a dream, too real to be ignored, yet too impossible to explain. In the morning, the room always appeared normal, untouched by the dread of the night before. Parents dismissed it as nightmares, and perhaps that explanation should have been enough, but the child knew in their bones that what they experienced was different. The fear did not fade with sunlight but lingered throughout the day, a quiet anxiety that made every shadow a threat. Even ordinary routines became colored by the memory of the night terrors. Going to bed was no longer a peaceful ritual, but a reluctant surrender, a gamble that the figure might return. These terrors built upon themselves, each one heavier than the last, until the child began to feel as though sleep was no longer a place of rest, but a passage into something dark, something waiting with patience, feeding on fear and growing stronger with every night that passed. The figure behind the door was not a memory that faded with time, but one that sharpened with every recollection, the kind of image that clings no matter how much one wishes to dismiss it. The door in question was not unusual, a simple wooden frame with a brass knob, leading out of the child's bedroom into the hallway. During the day it was unremarkable, used countless times without a second thought, but at night it took on a weight of its own. The child remembers lying in bed, watching it, sensing that something was always on the other side. It began with the feeling that the door was not quite still, that it shifted slightly in its frame, as though someone pressed gently against it from the hall. At first, it could be explained as the drafts of the house, the natural shifting of wood, but the more it happened, the harder it was to believe it was anything ordinary. The first time the figure revealed itself was subtle. The faint glow from the hallway nightlight spilled through the bottom crack of the door, but it was interrupted, blocked by the distinct shape of feet standing motionless outside. The child froze, eyes locked on the outline, waiting for the knob to turn or the figure to move, but nothing happened. The shadow remained silent, unmoving, and heavy in its stillness. Minutes dragged into hours until exhaustion pulled the child back into uneasy sleep, yet the image of those feet never left. The next night it returned, the same presence, the same frozen anticipation that something would open the door, but it never did. The ritual became routine, as if the figure had claimed its place outside the room and had no intention of leaving. Sometimes the shadow seemed taller, its outline stretching higher against the crack of light, as if leaning in closer. On other nights, faint creaks echoed as though weight shifted slowly from one foot to the other. The knob never turned, but the sensation that someone waited there was undeniable. The child gathered courage once, slipping out of bed and approaching the door with a racing heart, but as soon as the door opened, the hallway was empty. The nightlight glowed steadily, the floor was bare, and silence filled the space. There was no figure, no shadow, nothing to prove that the fear was real. Yet when the door was closed again and the child returned to bed, the feeling crept back, stronger than before, as though whatever stood there only revealed itself when the barrier remained between them. The memory carries with it a deep sense of helplessness. Telling adults about the figure led only to reassurances, to the same explanations about bad dreams and an overactive imagination. But dreams do not cast shadows across the floor, nor do they wait in silence for hours on end. The child began to dread not just the door, but the very act of nightfall, knowing that once the light dimmed, the figure would return to its place. It became a silent companion, unseen but undeniable, lingering behind the door with a patience that seemed almost human, almost deliberate, as if waiting for the right moment to finally cross the threshold. The forgotten room was never meant to be remembered, yet it lingered in memory like a place half dreamed and half real, the kind of space that feels hidden even when you stand inside it. It was part of the old house, tucked away at the end of a narrow hallway, a door that was always shut and rarely mentioned. The family never used it for much, a storage area at best, but to the child it carried a heaviness, a sense that it existed apart from the rest of the home. The air inside was always colder, and even in summer it smelled faintly of dust and damp wood, as if it belonged to another time. The child remembers how the light never seemed to settle there, even with the bulb switched on. Corners remained shrouded, and shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long. The first real memory of the room came from a day of exploration, when curiosity overcame the quiet warnings of parents who always discouraged spending time there. The door creaked open with effort, its hinges stiff from disuse, and the child stepped into a space that felt unsettlingly quiet. Boxes were stacked against the walls, their labels faded and their contents forgotten. An old mirror leaned crookedly in the corner, its surface stained and warped, reflecting distorted shapes that made the room look larger than it was. The floorboards groaned underfoot with each step, as though they had not been disturbed in years. Even at that age, the child felt a presence in the room, not visible but pressing, a kind of silence that listened. Nights brought a different quality to the memory. Sometimes lying in bed, the child would hear faint noises coming from the direction of the forgotten room, slow, deliberate knocks that did not echo like pipes or the house settling. Other times it was the sensation of air moving, a draft slipping beneath the closed door as if something shifted inside. The family never paid attention, brushing off the sounds as nothing, but for the child they carried weight. The sense grew stronger, as though the room held something it should not, something that waited for notice. There was one night that stood apart from the rest. The child, driven by both fear and curiosity, crept down the hall and stood before the door. The handle felt cold, almost damp, under their hand, and for a moment they considered turning back. But the silence on the other side seemed to call, pulling them closer. When the door opened, the air that rushed out felt wrong, thick with something that made the skin prickle. Inside, the boxes looked different, shifted as though moved by unseen hands, and the mirror in the corner reflected not the child's figure, but a shadow that did not match. For a heartbeat, it appeared that someone else stood in the room, watching from within the glass. Panic set in, and the child slammed the door shut, heart pounding as footsteps carried them back to bed. The memory of that night never faded. Though the room remained locked away and seldom spoken of, it lived on in the child's mind, a place that was not just forgotten but deliberately left behind, as if the house itself wished to keep whatever lingered there out of sight, but never truly gone. The silent girl in the mirror appeared first as nothing more than a trick of the eyes, a fleeting image glimpsed in the glass when the child moved past too quickly. At that age, mirrors already carried a strange fascination, the way they reflected the world but seemed to hold it at a distance, like another version of reality waiting just beyond the surface. It was while brushing teeth late at night, when the bathroom light flickered faintly, that the child noticed her. A pale shape, almost like their own reflection but not quite, lingering for a fraction too long after the child had stepped away. At first it was easy to dismiss, to believe it was imagination or tiredness playing cruel tricks. But the more time passed, the more defined she became. The girl was always there at the edges, never moving in perfect rhythm with the child's reflection. Sometimes she stood a little farther back, as though the mirrored room was deeper than the real one. Other times her face was slightly turned, her eyes cast sideways when the child looked straight ahead. She never spoke, never made a sound, yet her silence was louder than any scream could have been. Her lips were pale, almost colorless, and her dress looked like something from another era, old-fashioned and simple, with fabric that seemed to ripple as though underwater. Nights were the worst. Walking past a mirror in the dark felt unbearable, for even without direct light the child swore they could see her shape waiting. In the bedroom, where a small mirror hung on the wall, the girl sometimes appeared more clearly, her head tilted, her eyes following even when the child turned away. There were moments when she seemed closer, her face near the surface, her gaze steady and unblinking. On one unforgettable night, the child reached out with trembling fingers, daring to touch the cool surface, and though the mirror felt solid, there was a faint impression that something pressed back from the other side. The presence of the girl began to affect more than just the nights. In daylight, reflections carried unease. Glass windows, shiny surfaces, even puddles of water held the potential for her appearance. It was not constant, but random, unpredictable, as if she chose when to show herself. The child stopped trusting their own reflection, afraid to look too long for fear of what might stare back. Friends and family never noticed, never saw the flicker of movement or the faint figure lingering, and each attempt to explain was brushed away with laughter or gentle reassurances. The silence of the girl, paired with the silence of disbelief from others, created a deep isolation. Over time, the girl seemed to grow bolder. Her hands appeared pressed against the glass, pale palms flat against the surface, leaving no marks but creating the impression of a barrier too thin to last. Her eyes grew darker, deeper, pools of shadow that gave the sense she was studying, waiting. She never spoke, but her silence carried intent, as though words were unnecessary. The child came to dread mirrors, covering them at night, avoiding them in the day, yet somehow she always found a way to return, her presence etched into memory like a reflection that refused to fade. The toy that moved on its own was not one of those faint memories blurred by time, but a sharp recollection that still feels wrong whenever it surfaces. Every child has a favorite toy, something that carries comfort and familiarity, but in this case the toy became something far different. It was a small stuffed animal, worn from years of handling, its seams loose, its fabric faded, and its button eyes scratched from too much play. During the day it was nothing more than a companion, a harmless object tucked under the arm or resting on the bed. At night, however, it seemed to take on another life, a presence that lingered long after the lights were out. The first time the child noticed something strange was subtle. Waking in the middle of the night, they found the toy no longer at their side, but placed upright on the dresser across the room, its button eyes facing directly at the bed. The house was quiet, the door closed, and no one could have moved it without being noticed. Fear whispered that maybe it had been forgotten there before sleep, but the unease of those staring eyes made it hard to believe. The next night it happened again, the toy shifting places in the dark, sometimes closer to the bed, sometimes set in unnatural positions as though it had been carefully arranged. Soon the sounds began, a soft thud of fabric hitting the floor, the faint scrape of something being dragged, always just quiet enough to be dismissed but loud enough to be real. The child would wake to find the toy on the floor, or sitting on a chair where it had not been placed, its head tilted slightly as though observing. Each night the movements grew bolder, and with them came the distinct feeling of being watched. Lying in bed, the child felt those button eyes fixed in place, following every breath, every twitch beneath the covers. It was not just imagination. The air itself seemed to shift whenever the toy was near, heavy with a presence that was impossible to ignore. One night stands out more than all the others. The child awoke to the sensation of weight on the bed, something small pressing against the blanket near their feet. The toy sat there, perched upright, balanced in a way it should not have been able to hold. Panic froze every muscle as the child stared, waiting for movement, for proof of what they already felt. The toy did not move in that moment, but the pressure remained, the certainty that it had placed itself there. Eventually, with the courage born only of desperation, the child flung it across the room, heart pounding as it landed with a muffled sound. Sleep never came again that night, and when morning arrived, the toy was found neatly back on the dresser, facing the bed as if nothing had happened. The days after brought no relief. The toy always returned to its place, always seemed to find its way back, no matter where it was hidden. Closets, drawers, even the attic could not keep it away for long. It reappeared with a persistence that felt deliberate, a silent reminder that it could not be escaped. What once was a source of comfort had become an object of dread, a constant presence that haunted the edges of the child's nights and carved itself deep into memory. The voices that never faded began as faint whispers in the quiet of the night, sounds that could easily be mistaken for the hum of the house or the wind threading through cracks in the walls. But for the child, these whispers carried rhythm, pauses, and tones that resembled words, though never fully clear. At first, they were almost soothing, a background murmur that lulled the mind between wakefulness and sleep. But the comfort quickly turned into fear once it became clear that the voices were not random noises. They grew sharper, closer, as if standing just beyond the walls or under the bed, waiting for attention. Every night they seemed to return, patient and persistent. The child would lie still, straining ears to make sense of them, trying to catch even a single phrase, but the words dissolved into broken fragments the moment they were almost understood. Sometimes there were two voices, sometimes three, overlapping each other in low tones, as if carrying on a conversation without care for whether they were overheard. Other times, a single voice spoke with a steadiness that felt deliberate, as though addressing the child directly, though never in a language that made sense. The intent was enough to chill the air, for even nonsense syllables can carry menace when spoken in the dark. Attempts to block out the sound failed. Pulling blankets over the head, covering ears with hands, even pressing a pillow tightly could not silence the whispers completely. They seemed to bypass barriers, seeping into the mind as much as the ears. The child tried confiding in parents, but like so many other strange occurrences, the claims were brushed aside with reassurances that houses make noises and imaginations run wild at night. This dismissal only deepened the sense of isolation, leaving the child alone with the voices that never stopped. One night, the whispers grew bolder. Instead of fading when the child stirred, they grew louder, circling the room in invisible paths. The sensation was overwhelming, as though unseen figures leaned close, their words brushing against the skin like cold breath. For the first time, the child heard laughter within the voices, a quiet, mocking sound that turned fear into dread. It was no longer a matter of whether the voices were real, but why they chose to linger, why they refused to fade as easily as shadows in the morning light. Days became just as difficult. Though the voices were strongest at night, echoes of them carried into waking hours. In moments of quiet, while alone in a room, walking down a hallway, or pausing at the edge of sleep, they returned faintly, just enough to unsettle. Sometimes the child would spin around, certain that someone had spoken just behind them, only to find emptiness. The persistence wore down the sense of safety, blurring the line between normal life and haunting intrusion. The voices left behind more than sound. They created an impression, an awareness that something unseen had marked its presence. They lingered not just in the ears but in the mind, a constant reminder that silence was never truly silent. Long after the house grew still, long after the child grew older, the voices carried on in memory, as vivid as the nights they first began. When the past returns to haunt, it does not announce itself with grand gestures, but with subtle reminders that grow impossible to ignore. The memories of childhood that had once seemed like scattered nightmares began weaving themselves into a single thread, revealing a picture too clear and too dark to dismiss. The closet whispers, the figure behind the door, the forgotten room, the girl in the mirror, the toy that refused to stay still, the scratches that appeared without reason, and the voices that whispered through the silence were not isolated events, but fragments of one continuous presence. Each memory, once believed to stand alone, began to feel like pieces of the same haunting force, patient and deliberate, following from one stage of life to the next. The child who once trembled under blankets had grown, yet the fears did not vanish with age. Instead, they lingered at the edges of adult life, unexplained sounds in the quiet of night, a fleeting glimpse of movement in a mirror, a dream that felt too real to be dismissed. At first it was easier to blame stress, exhaustion, or an overactive mind, but deep down the same dread returned, whispering that these memories were not mere inventions of childhood imagination. They were real, and they were waiting. The turning point came one evening while revisiting the old family home, long abandoned but still standing in its tired silence. Dust covered the floor, the wallpaper peeled, and the air carried the heavy scent of neglect. Walking through those rooms was like stepping back in time, every corner heavy with familiarity and fear. The closet door still creaked the same way, the forgotten room still exhaled its cold, damp breath, and the mirror in the hall reflected more shadow than light. It was there, in that mirror, that the figure of the silent girl appeared once more, as clear and unrelenting as ever. She stood behind the reflection, not aged, not changed, as though she had been waiting all those years. In that moment, the pieces aligned. The scratches, the whispers, the toy, the voices. They were not random hauntings, but the marks of something that had chosen to stay, bound not to the house but to the child who had grown into an adult. The realization was crushing. The past had never truly been left behind. What had been endured in childhood was only the beginning of a haunting that stretched across time itself. As the final step out of that house was taken, the truth settled in. There is no real escape from memories that carve themselves so deeply into the mind and spirit. They are carried forward, alive in every silence, every reflection, every moment of stillness. What had once been dismissed as imagination proved to be a lingering truth, a shadow that followed from childhood into adulthood, refusing to fade. The three disturbing childhood memories were not just stories to be told. They were pieces of a haunting that never ended, a reminder that some fears live forever within us. Thank you for joining me through this chilling journey into the echoes of childhood fear. Your time, your attention, and your courage to face these dark memories mean everything. Remember, what we carry from our past shapes the shadows of our present. Stay safe, stay aware, and never ignore the whispers in the dark.